All right, thank you so much. I've already had a chance to speak, so I'm going to try and keep it brief so we can open it up and talk together. That said, I have what I've marked down as 8 little points to make. So I'm trying 8 little points. Okay, so the first thing that struck me when I was reading Catherine's paper and the research that has started was, it was so interesting, the amazing role that non-legislative work plays in the regimes in Ontario and Quebec. As a person just reading the acts, you would think they were actually kind of similar in a lot of ways. And the realities on the ground are very, very different because of policy choices that have been made at both boards and various other factors and players that are sort of outside of the public legislative discussion and regime. And I think that's a really interesting point. I don't know what to make of it. In Ontario, it's very significant in how return to work works. If you look at the Ontario Act, you would think that all that happens is a worker and employer try and work together, and if it doesn't work out, oh well. Maybe the board might come in and help sort it out, but that's kind of it. But the WSIB decided a few years back that's not an effective way to do return to work, to become very interventionist, and they started to deliberately step in. On the same token, when you look at the Quebec Act, as I did when we were looking at the Caron case, I thought, okay, well, there's all these anti-discrimination provisions. There's these protections on workers. This looks like there should be consideration of human rights principles in Quebec based on the law, but that's not at all the case of what was happening on the ground. So that was interesting, both in terms of just for workers to know what to expect. There's a lot that's not transparent to workers on the ground. Okay, so my second point is sort of a related question that always bothers me about the return to work space is, particularly in Ontario, we see that the parties who are have the most control and power in the return to work equation are maybe driven by incentives that are not necessarily in line with the successful return to work always. And I question, can this work? So you have, for example, WSIB as the primary mediator of non-unionized injured workers return to work. If WSIB is driven like an insurance company to reduce benefits, can it work as a successful return to work organization? Is there a way to decouple the incentives to make it function better so that there is successful return to work and not, which there of course sometimes is, but sometimes there is not successful return to work and still benefits end because of the way the system is set up. And I'm happy to share, we got some interesting information from inside WSIB that shows like they look at every case where they did a survey of all these cases where workers were in early and safe return to work, like shortly after an injury, and declined employment and said like, I can't come back. And they surveyed, they looked through all the files and was like, oh, why are people declining jobs? And the primary reasons that injured workers declined to return to work was their own perception of pain and disability, and which was 53% of the cases, and 36% of the workers believed that the work was not suitable, leading the WCB to conclude that there was a clear disconnect between identifying safe and suitable work and the worker agreeing that the work is suitable. Which is interesting. So, I mean, there is some sort of internal research happening, but how do we think about what that means for a successful return to work? Third point, which is related, is the important role that doctors could play in Ontario. If we could learn a lesson from Quebec, I think that could potentially really help with this question around return to work. The fourth point I was thinking about in listening to everything today, and this is more kind of, I guess, work of advocates, but how do we as advocates meaningfully incorporate all this research that's happening into advocacy alongside workers? And that's not really a question for researchers, I don't think, but maybe it's a question of how partnerships can work to get this stuff meaningfully before decision makers and policymakers on a more regular basis. The fifth thing I was wondering about was, the intersections of the structural realities that appear to be across the country. So particularly with the mobile workforce and migrant workers, there appear to be real common structures around how return to work and deeming and loss of earnings work across the provinces. And those tie into the kind of structural realities of those worker programs, so that they're really, it's interesting to think not just about these as like the individual experiences of the workers, but also these kind of structural lines that are running through. And tied to that, the idea, I think, of how discrimination, racialization, and race may be part and parcel of those structures of disadvantage and oppression. The seventh thing I was thinking about, which was kind of around the way return to work is discussed more in the Ontario context, which is kind of this, it's bandied about as the high success rate. Ontario is so successful in returning everyone to work. We have a 92% success rate. But that, that 92% is obscuring the workers who are the most vulnerable, who are not falling through the cracks, who are precarious. And so by just using these numbers of high success rates, we're kind of losing the nuance and the drive to figure out what's going wrong when it is going wrong, and the importance of pushing policymakers and boards and stuff to continue, to continue to do more systemic long-term tracking. I know in Ontario, ONIWIG, Steve Mantis and Carl have been pushing for years and years and years, and researchers to get, for example, WSIB to do like long-term substantive tracking of actual return to work outcomes. And that has been difficult and challenging, I think, at times, and that's important to continue that request, because that is the kind of data that could actually be really meaningful to us to understand what is going wrong. Okay, and I said 8, so I'm almost done, but the last thing is just in Ontario, I think, probably in Quebec too, but it seems like in Quebec there are some protections from this kind of race to the bottom mentality with precarious workers, and we can really learn a lot, I think, from those protections around the minimum wage, because the way Ontario workers' compensation law, but also not just the law, like those kind of soft law, those internal decisions of WSIB negatively affect precarious workers is quite stunning. For example, looking at workers who are on contract or part-time, seasonal or migrant, or underemployed, only getting a few hours of work. When those people are injured, the board is, really flattening out their wage rate to the rate where they're far, far below the minimum wage, and thus removing any real meaningful protections that could be created by the compensation system, because even full benefits are going to be significantly less than welfare frequently. So this is really counter to public policy or something, and that a lot could be learned from Quebec through that experience. Okay, that's it.
Thank you.